The sound of a lone gunshot echoed across the vast, empty desert as Quentin Rowe stared at the bleeding body of his brother. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving New Mexico Territory had claimed yet another soul. Quentin's weathered face, aged beyond his 32 years, remained stoic as he knelt beside his younger brother's final resting place, a simple wooden cross marking the spot where outlaws had ambushed them 3 days prior. "Rest easy, Thomas," Quentin whispered, placing his brother's favorite pocket watch atop the freshly turned soil. The silver timepiece glinted in the harsh sunlight, a stark reminder that time continued its relentless march forward, even when it felt like Quentin's own world had stopped spinning. The journey back to the nearest town was long and silent, with only the rhythmic clop of his chestnut mare's hooves and the occasional distant howl of a coyote for company. Quentin's once bright blue eyes had dulled over the years, first from the horrors he'd witnessed during his time as a Union soldier, then from the harsh realities of frontier life, and now from the crushing weight of being the last row standing. Clearwater was a modest but growing settlement nestled between rolling hills and the snaking curve of the Pecos River. Like many frontier towns, it had sprouted almost overnight when silver was discovered nearby, transforming from a simple trading post to a bustling community of hopeful miners, weary travelers, and those looking to profit from both. The main street was alive with activity as Quentin rode in. Women in practical cotton dresses moved between the general store and the post office, miners trudged to and from the saloon, and children darted between wagons and horses in improvised games of tag. None of it registered in Quentin's vacant gaze as he made his way to the livery stable. "Mr. Rowe," the stable hand, a gangly teenager named Billy, called out as Quentin dismounted. "Heard about your brother. Mighty sorry." Quentin handed over the reins with a curt nod, his throat too tight for words. He reached into his pocket, extracting a few coins to pay for the mare's care. "No need for that today, sir," Billy said softly. "Consider it my condolences." Any other day, Quentin might have insisted, his pride too stubborn to accept charity. Today, he simply nodded again and turned toward the saloon. The weight of his gun belt seemed heavier than usual, the leather worn smooth from years of wear. His spurs jingled with each step, announcing his presence to anyone who cared to listen. The Red River Saloon was half full, a mix of locals and travelers seeking respite from the afternoon heat. Conversations quieted momentarily as Quentin pushed through the swinging doors, but quickly resumed when the patrons recognized him as a local rather than trouble. He made his way to the bar, where the owner, a burly man named Pete, was already pouring a glass of whiskey. "This one's on the house," Pete said, sliding the amber liquid across the worn wooden bar top. "Real sorry about Thomas. He was a good man." Quentin accepted the drink with a slight incline of his head, downing it in one burning swallow before signaling for another. This had been his routine for the past 3 days, riding out to his brother's grave in the morning, returning to town by mid-afternoon, and drinking until the memories blurred enough for him to find a few hours of fitful sleep. "You ought to eat something," Pete suggested as he poured a second whiskey. "Can't live on this stuff alone, though plenty have tried." "Not hungry," Quentin replied, his voice rough from disuse. Pete shrugged and moved on to other customers, leaving Quentin alone with his grief and growing collection of empty glasses. The afternoon stretched into evening, and the saloon filled with more patrons seeking entertainment after a long day's work. The piano player arrived, filling the room with lively tunes that seemed to mock Quentin's somber mood. He was contemplating whether to order another drink or stumble back to his rented room at the boarding house when a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. A group of trail-dusty cowboys had entered, laughing boisterously as they surrounded a slender figure in a blue dress. "Come on now, miss," one of them drawled, his words slurring slightly. "Just one dance. We've been on the trail for weeks with nothing but ugly cowpokes to look at." "I appreciate the offer," came the firm reply from a woman's voice, "but I'm here on business, not pleasure." Something about her tone, clear, confident, but not unkind, made Quentin glance over. She stood with perfect posture, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, though a few tendrils had escaped to frame her face. Her dress was simple but well made, suggesting someone of means but not ostentation. What kind of business brings a lady to a saloon? Another cowboy pressed, stepping closer to her. Before she could answer, Pete intervened. "The lady is Dr. Katherine Davis, boys. She's our new town physician, and I expect you to treat her with respect under my roof." A female doctor. Quentin had heard of such things back east, but hadn't expected to encounter one in a frontier town like Clearwater. The cowboys seemed equally surprised, their expressions ranging from skepticism to amusement. "A lady doctor," the first cowboy scoffed. "What's next, female sheriff's doctor?" Davis smiled thinly. "I assure you, my credentials are quite legitimate. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm meeting someone." To Quentin's surprise, she moved purposefully through the crowd toward the bar directly toward him. He straightened slightly, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance after days of neglect. "Mr. Rowe?" she asked, stopping before him. "I'm Dr. Katherine Davis. Pete mentioned you might be here. I wanted to express my condolences about your brother." Quentin stared at her, momentarily at a loss for words. Up close, he could see that her eyes were a striking shade of green, clear and intelligent. "Thank you," he finally managed, the words feeling inadequate. "I arrived in town yesterday," she continued. "I understand your brother was shot during a robbery attempt." "Ambush," Quentin corrected, his jaw tightening. "Bastards were waiting for us on the trail from Santa Fe." Dr. Davis nodded solemnly. "I'm very sorry. I know words offer little comfort at times like these." She was right about that. Quentin had heard enough platitudes in the past few days to last a lifetime. He expected her to move on, having paid her respects to a stranger, but instead she hesitated. "Mr. Rowe, I don't wish to impose, but I've been told you're quite knowledgeable about the surrounding area." Quentin raised an eyebrow. "I've been around these parts for 5 years or so." "I need a guide," she explained. "I'm establishing my practice here in town, but I also intend to visit the outlying homesteads and ranches regularly. Many families can't make it into town when they need medical attention." "There are others more suited," Quentin replied, reaching for his glass. "I'm not much company these days." Dr. Davis studied him with a gaze that seemed to see more than Quentin was comfortable revealing. "Perhaps not," she agreed. "But Pete mentioned you know every trail and creek for 50 miles in any direction. That's what I need, someone who knows the land, not necessarily someone conversational." Despite himself, Quentin felt a flicker of something that might have been amusement in another lifetime. "You're direct, Doc." "I find it saves time," she replied with a small smile. "I can pay well, and I only need your services once or twice a week, at least initially." Quentin considered the offer. His funds were dwindling, and the prospect of regular work was tempting. More importantly, it would give him something to focus on besides his grief and the growing desire for revenge against his brother's killers. "When do you want to start?" he asked. "Thursday morning, if that suits," she said, seemingly unsurprised by his acceptance. "I'd like to visit the Wilson homestead first. I understand Mrs. Wilson is expecting soon." Quentin nodded. "The Wilsons are about 3 hours' ride northeast. Not a difficult trail, but easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for." "Perfect. Shall we meet at the livery at 7? "I'll be there," Quentin confirmed, draining the last of his whiskey. Dr. Davis smiled, the expression brightening her already attractive features. "Thank you, Mr. Rowe. I look forward to our journey." As she walked away, Quentin found himself watching her progress through the crowded saloon. There was something different about Katherine Davis, a quiet confidence that demanded respect without asking for it. For the first time in days, his thoughts had momentarily shifted away from his brother's death, a fact that left him with a complicated mixture of relief and guilt. Thursday arrived with a brilliant sunrise that painted the desert landscape in hues of gold and rose. Quentin was already at the livery when Dr. Davis arrived, dressed in a practical riding outfit of divided skirts that allowed her to ride astride rather than side saddle. She led a dappled gray mare, already saddled and loaded with medical supplies. "Good morning, Mr. Rowe," she greeted him, her voice bright despite the early hour. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." Just got here myself, Quentin replied, checking the cinch on his own saddle. Weather's good for riding, should stay clear all day. They set out at an easy pace, the morning still cool enough for comfortable travel. Dr. Davis proved to be a competent rider, handling her mare with the ease of someone who had spent considerable time in the saddle. She also seemed content with silence, allowing Quentin his thoughts as they traveled the winding trail northeastward. It was only after they had been riding for over an hour that she spoke again. "May I ask how long you've been in the territory, Mr. Rowe?" "Came out after the war," Quentin answered, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. "Tried my hand at ranching for a spell in Texas, but it didn't take. Been drifting mostly until Thomas and I settled near Clearwater about 5 years back." "The war between the states," she nodded. "You served with the Union forces?" 8th Illinois Cavalry, he confirmed. "Thomas was too young to fight." "I trained at a hospital in Philadelphia during the later years of the conflict," she offered. "That's where I decided to pursue medicine." Quentin glanced at her with newfound interest. "Must have been difficult for a woman." "It was," she admitted. "There were many who believed women lacked the constitution for medical work. Ironically, it was the war that provided opportunities. With so many male doctors serving at the front, women were needed to fill the gaps." "And what brings you to a place like Clearwater?" Quentin asked. "Can't imagine there's much opportunity compared to a city back east," Katherine smiled. "On the contrary. In Philadelphia, I would be one of dozens of physicians competing for patients, and many would refuse to see a female doctor on principle. Here, I'm needed. People care more about having a doctor at all than about that doctor's gender." Quentin nodded, seeing the logic in her reasoning. "Still, frontier life isn't easy, especially for someone used to city comforts." "I grew up on a farm in Ohio, Mr. Rowe," she informed him with a hint of amusement. "I'm no stranger to hard work or simple living. Besides, I find the landscape here quite beautiful in its own way." She gestured toward the vast expanse of desert and distant mountains. The morning sun illuminated the scene, highlighting the rich reds and golds of the terrain against the deep blue sky. It was beautiful, Quentin had to admit, though he hadn't really noticed it in a long while. Their conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they continued their journey. Eventually, they crested a small rise, and the Wilson homestead came into view, a modest cabin with a barn and corral, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. As they approached, the door opened and James Wilson stepped out, rifle in hand, until he recognized Quentin. "Rowe," he called out in greeting, lowering his weapon. "Wasn't expecting visitors. Brought the new doctor to see your wife," Quentin explained as they drew closer. Wilson's weathered face brightened. "The lady doctor, Sarah, will be mighty pleased. She's been worried about having no midwife nearby." Katherine dismounted gracefully, gathering her medical bag. "Dr. Katherine Davis," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "I understand your wife is expecting?" "Yes, madam," Wilson confirmed, shaking her hand. "Our fourth. Due in about 2 months, we reckon. Please come inside." Quentin remained outside with the horses while Katherine went in to examine Mrs. Wilson. He used the time to water the animals and check their shoes, refusing Wilson's offer of coffee with a polite shake of his head. His interaction with Katherine had drained his limited social energy, and he preferred the solitude of the corral. Nearly an hour passed before Katherine emerged from the cabin, Wilson following behind with a relieved smile. "Everything looks perfect," she was assuring him. "Your wife is healthy and the baby seems to be developing exactly as it should. I'll come back to check on her in a few weeks." After promising to send some herbal tea for Mrs. Wilson's occasional nausea and accepting a package of freshly baked corn bread in return, they were back on the trail. Quentin noticed that Katherine seemed pleased with the visit. "A successful consultation?" he inquired as they rode. "Very much so," she confirmed. "Mrs. Wilson is in excellent health, though understandably anxious about delivering so far from town. I've promised to be here when her time comes." "Even if that's the middle of the night?" Quentin asked, raising an eyebrow. Katherine gave him a measured look. "Babies rarely arrive at convenient hours, Mr. Rowe. It's part of being a physician. And if you need to get here in a hurry, in the dark..." Then I suppose I might require your services again, she replied with a slight smile, assuming you're willing. Quentin found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the commitment. I'm willing. The return journey passed more quickly, with Katherine asking occasional questions about the land and its features, clearly trying to learn the route for herself. Quentin found himself pointing out landmarks and explaining how to identify the correct trail among the many that crisscrossed the territory. As they approached Clearwater in the late afternoon, Katherine turned to him. Thank you for today, Mr. Rowe. You've been incredibly helpful. Would you be available again next Tuesday? There's a ranch to the southwest I'd like to visit. I'll be at the livery at 7, Quentin confirmed. Katherine smiled, that same warm expression that somehow made her green eyes brighter. Perfect. Oh, and Mr. Rowe. I do hope you'll call me Katherine. Dr. Davis is for my patients, and the lady doctor is what everyone else in town calls me. It would be nice to hear my name occasionally. Quentin, caught off guard by the request, simply nodded. Katherine, then. And I suppose you might as well call me Quentin. Quentin, she repeated, as if testing the name. Thank you for today, Quentin. I'll see you Tuesday. As he watched her ride toward her office on the edge of town, Quentin realized that the day had passed without him thinking of Thomas or revenge more than a handful of times. The realization brought a fresh wave of guilt, but also a small measure of relief. Perhaps focusing on work was what he needed, something to occupy his mind during the daylight hours at least. Over the next few weeks, Quentin and Katherine fell into a routine. Twice a week, they would ride out to visit homesteads, ranches, and even the mining camp that had sprung up 10 miles south of town. Katherine proved to be an exceptional physician, treating everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses with quiet competence that quickly earned the respect of even the most skeptical frontiersmen. Gradually, Quentin found himself talking more during their journeys. Katherine had a gift for asking questions that invited conversation rather than demanded it, and her own stories of her medical training, her childhood on an Ohio farm, her brief stint as a nurse during the war's final year were interesting enough to hold his attention. Most surprisingly, he discovered that she possessed a dry wit that occasionally caught him off guard. More than once, her deadpan observations about the quirks of frontier life had almost made him smile. It was during their 4th week of travels, as they returned from visiting an isolated sheep ranch, that Katherine broached a subject Quentin had been carefully avoiding. I heard in town that you've been asking questions about the men who ambushed you and your brother, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Quentin's expression hardened. What of it? I was merely wondering what you intend to do if you find them. What do you think? He asked coldly. Katherine studied him for a long moment. I think you're planning to kill them. They murdered my brother in cold blood, Quentin stated flatly. They deserve nothing less. And after you've killed them, what then? She pressed. Quentin shrugged. Haven't thought that far ahead, haven't you? Katherine's gaze was penetrating. Quentin, I've treated men consumed by revenge before. It rarely brings them the peace they're seeking. I'm not looking for peace, he replied honestly, just justice. Are they the same thing in this case? She asked quietly. Quentin didn't answer and Katherine didn't push further. They rode in silence for several miles, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. I don't expect you to understand, Quentin finally said as the town came into view in the distance. Don't I? Katherine's voice had a sharp edge he hadn't heard before. My father and younger brother were killed by raiders during the war, Confederate deserters who decided our farm looked like easy pickings. Quentin turned to look at her, surprised by the revelation. Her expression was distant, remembering. I was 17, she continued. My mother and I were in town when it happened. When we returned, the house had been ransacked, and they were. She took a steadying breath. I wanted revenge too, Quentin. I understood exactly that blind rage you're feeling. What happened to the men who did it? He asked. A Union patrol caught them 2 weeks later. They were tried and hanged. She met his gaze directly. And do you know what? It didn't help. They were dead, but so were my father and brother. Nothing changed except that the anger had nowhere left to go. Quentin looked away, uncomfortable with both her story and the truth it contained. "I'm sorry about your family," he said stiffly. "As I am about your brother," she replied softly. "I'm not telling you what to do, Quentin. I just hope you'll consider whether this path leads anywhere you truly want to go." They reached town without further discussion of revenge or justice, parting ways at the livery with their usual arrangement to meet again in 3 days. Quentin watched her go, troubled by their conversation in a way he hadn't anticipated. That night, in his room at the boarding house, he pulled out the worn, wanted poster he'd obtained from the sheriff. 3 men were believed responsible for the string of ambushes that had claimed Thomas and 4 other travelers over the past months. Led by a notorious outlaw named Jeremiah Pike, they were thought to be hiding in the hills near the territorial border. Quentin had been planning to set out after them once he had gathered enough information. He had even purchased extra ammunition and supplies, stored carefully under his bed. But now, Catherine's words echoed in his mind, making him question what had seemed so clear just days ago. Would killing these men truly honor Thomas's memory? Or was Katherine right? Would it change nothing except to potentially send Quentin to the gallows himself? He was still wrestling with these questions the next morning when urgent knocking at his door roused him from a fitful sleep. It was Billy from the livery, looking anxious. "Mr. Rowe, sir, Doc Davis sent me to fetch you. Says it's urgent. Mrs. Wilson's time has come early and there are complications. She needs to get there fast and says you're the only one who can guide her safely in this weather." Quentin glanced out the window to see heavy rain falling, turning the town's dirt streets to mud. A difficult journey in the best of circumstances, and potentially dangerous with the arroyos likely to flood. "Tell her I'll meet her at the livery in 10 minutes, he said, already reaching for his clothes. The rain was coming down in sheets by the time they set out, Catherine's medical bag protected by oilcloth and strapped securely to her saddle. They rode hard, Quentin leading them along higher ground to avoid the flash floods that could sweep through the lower trails without warning. The journey that had taken 3 hours in good weather stretched to nearly 5 as they carefully navigated treacherous conditions. By the time they reached the Wilson homestead, both riders and horses were exhausted and soaked to the skin. James Wilson ushered them inside immediately, his face lined with worry. "Sarah's been in labor since yesterday evening," he explained as Katherine removed her dripping coat. Everything seemed normal at first, but then the pains got real bad and strange. "She's bleeding some and the baby hasn't come." Catherine's demeanor changed instantly, all trace of the tired traveler replaced by focused determination. "Show me to her," she instructed, gathering her medical bag. Quentin remained in the main room with the 3 Wilson children, who huddled together by the fire, wide-eyed and frightened. The oldest, a girl of about 10, was trying to be brave for her younger siblings. "Your pa says you're Emma," Quentin said, awkwardly attempting to distract them. "That right," the girl nodded solemnly. "Well, Emma, I reckon your ma's in the best hands possible. Doc Davis is the finest physician I've ever known, even better than male doctors," the middle child, a boy of perhaps 7, asked skeptically. "Better than most I've met," Quentin confirmed. She patched up Sam Jenkins after his horse threw him into a ravine. Doc before her would have just taken the leg off, but Dr. Davis saved it. This seemed to reassure the children somewhat, and Emma suggested they play a quiet game of checkers. Quentin found himself drawn into keeping score as the hours passed, the rain continuing its steady drumming on the roof. Occasionally, he would hear muffled sounds from the bedroom, Catherine's calm instructions, Wilson's murmured responses, and sometimes Sarah's pained cries. Each time, he found himself holding his breath until Catherine's voice resumed its steady rhythm, reassuring him that she remained in control of the situation. It was near midnight when the bedroom door finally opened, and Katherine emerged, looking exhausted but triumphant. In her arms was a tiny bundle, and behind her, Wilson was beaming despite his obvious fatigue. "Children," Katherine announced, "come meet your new sister." The 3 Wilson children crowded around, exclaiming over the infant's tiny features. Quentin hung back, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the family moment, but Katherine caught his eye over the children's heads and smiled a genuine, joyful expression that transformed her tired face. Later, after the children had been ushered off to bed and the baby returned to her mother, Katherine joined Quentin by the fire. Wilson had insisted they stay the night rather than risk the journey back to town in the darkness and continuing rain. "Thank you for getting me here in time," she said quietly, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Without proper medical attention, we would have lost both mother and child. You did all the hard work," Quentin demurred. "I just knew which trail to take." Katherine shook her head. "Don't diminish your role, Quentin. That knowledge saved 3 lives today: Sarah, the baby, and James, who would have been destroyed by their loss." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the gentle patter of rain creating a peaceful backdrop. "I haven't delivered a baby since my time in Philadelphia," Katherine admitted eventually. "I was terrified I would fail them." Quentin looked at her in surprise. "You didn't show it. You seemed completely confident." "A physician can never show fear to patients," she explained with a small smile. "It's one of the first lessons we learn, but inside." She shook her head. "Inside, I was praying I remembered everything correctly." "You did," Quentin said simply. "You saved them." Katherine's smile softened. "We saved them," she corrected gently. "It was a team effort, Quentin." Something about the way she said his name, combined with the shared intensity of the day's experience, created a moment of connection that Quentin hadn't felt with another person in years. For a brief instant, he almost smiled. The muscles around his mouth actually twitched with the forgotten movement, but the expression never fully formed. Katherine noticed, her observant eyes catching the subtle change. "When was the last time you smiled, Quentin?" she asked softly. The question caught him off guard. "I don't recall," he answered honestly after a moment of reflection. "Before the war, maybe." Instead of the pity he expected, Katherine's expression held only quiet understanding. "It'll come back," she said simply. "You just need rest." "Rest?" He echoed, puzzled by her choice of words. "Rest from the weight you've been carrying," she clarified. "The grief, the anger, the revenge. It's exhausting, isn't it? Always being on guard, never allowing yourself a moment of peace or joy because it feels like betrayal." Quentin stared into the fire, uncomfortable with how accurately she had described his state of mind. "What makes you think a smile would come back even if I wanted it to?" "Because I've seen glimpses of the man beneath the grief," Katherine replied. "When you're focused on a task, helping someone, or even just explaining some feature of the landscape, you find interesting there's a light there that grief hasn't fully extinguished." Her words stirred something in Quentin's chest, not hope exactly, but perhaps the recognition that hope might still be possible. Before he could respond, however, Wilson returned from checking on his wife. "Sarah's sleeping peacefully, Doc," he reported. "Baby too." "Don't know how to thank you both enough." "No thanks needed," Katherine assured him. "I'm just glad we could help." They stayed at the Wilson homestead for 2 more days, waiting for the rain to subside and the trails to become passable again. During that time, Quentin found himself drawn into the rhythm of family life in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. He helped Wilson repair a leak in the roof, chopped firewood to replenish their dwindling supply, and even reluctantly allowed Emma to teach him a card game she had invented. Katherine, meanwhile, divided her time between caring for Sarah and the newborn, whom the Wilsons had decided to name Katherine in her honor, and entertaining the other children with stories and simple science demonstrations. She showed them how to make a simple stethoscope using a funnel and rubber tubing, letting them listen to each other's heartbeats with expressions of wonder. Watching her interact with the children, Quentin was struck by how different she was from any woman he had known before. She combined practical competence with genuine warmth, intelligence with humility, strength with gentleness. It was a compelling combination that he found increasingly difficult to ignore. On the morning of their departure, the sun finally emerged, turning the rain-washed landscape into a glistening panorama of greens and golds. The normally dusty trail was muddy but navigable, and after ensuring that both Sarah and baby Katherine were continuing to thrive, they prepared to return to Clearwater. "You'll come back in 2 weeks?" Sarah asked anxiously as they said their goodbyes. "Sooner if needed," Katherine promised, "but everything looks wonderful. You're healing beautifully, and little Katherine is perfect." As they rode away from the homestead, Quentin felt strangely reluctant to return to town. The past days had been peaceful in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The routine of the Wilson household, the children's laughter, the simple satisfaction of completing practical tasks all had created a respite from his usual thoughts of loss and revenge. "You were good with them," Katherine observed as they navigated a particularly muddy stretch of trail. "The children, I mean, they took to you quickly," Quentin shrugged uncomfortably. "Kids are easy, they don't expect much." On the contrary, Katherine disagreed. "Children have excellent instincts about people. They trust you because you're trustworthy, even if you don't see it yourself." He didn't know how to respond to that, so they rode in silence for a while. The landscape around them was transformed by the recent rains, with wildflowers beginning to appear in patches across the normally arid terrain. Katherine pointed them out occasionally, identifying different varieties and their medicinal properties. "That one there, the small purple flower, can be used to make a tincture for headaches," she explained. "And those yellow ones are excellent for digestive complaints." "You know a lot about plants," Quentin observed. Katherine nodded. "My mother was skilled with herbal remedies. She taught me the basics, which I later supplemented with formal medical training. Out here, where pharmaceutical supplies are limited, those old remedies are often the best option. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Katherine agreed, a hint of sadness touching her voice. "She passed away 2 years ago, pneumonia in the end, though I think she never fully recovered from losing my father and brother." "I'm sorry," Quentin said sincerely. "Seems we've both lost more than our share." Katherine turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that's why we understand each other." The simple observation lingered between them as they continued their journey, creating a sense of connection that neither felt the need to articulate further. By the time they reached Clearwater in the late afternoon, something had shifted subtly in their relationship, a deepening of trust, a recognition of shared experience that transcended their professional arrangement. As they parted at the livery, Katherine touched his arm lightly. "Thank you again, Quentin, not just for the guidance, but for your help with the Wilsons. Your presence was a comfort to them and to me." The touch was brief, but Quentin felt it long after she had gone, a warmth that seemed to spread from that point of contact throughout his body. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but not an unwelcome one. That night, for the first time since Thomas's death, Quentin didn't seek solace in the bottom of a whiskey glass. Instead, he sat on the small porch of the boarding house, watching the stars emerge in the clearing sky and allowing his thoughts to wander beyond grief and revenge to the possibility of something else, something he wasn't yet ready to name, but could no longer entirely ignore. Over the next few weeks, Quentin's partnership with Katherine evolved beyond their twice-weekly excursions to visit patients. He began helping around her clinic, initially with simple repairs to the building, fixing a loose shutter, reinforcing a sagging porch step, but gradually assisting with other tasks as well. He built shelves for her growing collection of medicines and medical texts, constructed a hitching post for patients arriving on horseback, and even fashioned a simple wheelchair using parts salvaged from an abandoned wagon. Katherine, in turn, began inviting him to share meals with her, either at the small table in her living quarters behind the clinic or occasionally at the town's only restaurant. Their conversations ranged widely, from practical discussions about the routes to various homesteads to deeper exchanges about books they had read or experiences that had shaped them. Gradually, Quentin found himself drawn into the life of the town in a way he hadn't been before. People who had previously known him only as the Rowe brother who survived began to greet him by name, stopping to chat about the weather or ask his opinion on the quality of goods at the general store. He realized that Katherine, through her quiet influence, had helped him become part of the community rather than merely existing within it. It was during this period that Quentin made a decision about the outlaws who had killed Thomas. After a long night of soul-searching, he gathered the information he had collected and rode to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. There, he provided everything he knew about Jeremiah Pike and his gang, including their likely hideout location. "You're not planning to go after them yourself?" The marshal, a weathered man named Harding, asked suspiciously. "No," Quentin replied, surprising himself with how true the answer felt. "They need to face justice, but I don't need to be the one to deliver it." Marshal Harding studied him for a moment before nodding. "Wise decision. We've been building a case against Pike for months. Your information might be what we need to finally bring him in." Quentin rode back to Clearwater feeling lighter than he had in months. He hadn't forgiven the men who killed his brother. He wasn't sure he ever could, but he had chosen a path that honored Thomas without destroying himself in the process. He found Katherine treating a miner with a crushed hand when he returned and waited patiently until she had finished bandaging the injury and providing instructions for care. When the man had gone, she turned to Quentin with a tired smile. "You were gone all day," she observed, washing her hands in a basin. "I missed your help with Mr. Collins and his endless stories about his mining days." "I rode to Santa Fe," Quentin explained, leaning against the doorframe, "gave my information on Pike's gang to Marshal Harding." Katherine's hands stilled, water dripping from her fingers as she looked up at him in surprise. "You did. You were right," he admitted, meeting her gaze directly. "Revenge wouldn't bring Thomas back or honor his memory. It would just create more violence." The smile that bloomed across Katherine's face was radiant. "Quentin, I'm proud of you." Something warm unfurled in Quentin's chest at her words. "I still want them caught and punished," he clarified, "but legally through proper channels." "Of course," she nodded. "Justice is important. It's the means that matter." She dried her hands and moved closer to him, her expression softening. "This is a significant step, Quentin, choosing life over vengeance. It takes courage. Wouldn't have made that choice without you," he said quietly. "You helped me see another way forward." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then Katherine smiled and gestured toward the back of the clinic. "I was about to prepare dinner. Would you care to join me?" "I have fresh bread from the baker and some stew that's been simmering all day." "I'd like that," Quentin replied, following her through the clinic to her modest living quarters. The small apartment was simply but comfortably furnished, with a kitchen area, a round table with 4 chairs, and a sitting area with a bookshelf overflowing with medical texts and other volumes. Personal touches, a colorful quilt draped over a chair, pressed wildflowers framed on the wall. A delicate china teacup on the mantel gave the space a homey feel that reflected Katherine's practical yet refined sensibilities. As they shared the meal, their conversation flowed easily, touching on the day's events, Katherine's patience, and Quentin's journey to Santa Fe. There was a new ease between them, a sense of shared understanding that made words almost unnecessary at times. It was only as Quentin was preparing to leave that Katherine brought up a topic that caught him by surprise. "The town council is organizing a summer social next Saturday," she mentioned casually. "A dance at the new community hall with food and music. They've asked me to attend as one of the town's leading citizens." She made a face that clearly indicated her amusement at the designation. "Sounds nice," Quentin replied neutrally, already thinking about how he would avoid the event. "I was hoping you might accompany me," Katherine continued, a hint of uncertainty in her voice that was unusual for her. "As my escort," Quentin stared at her, momentarily speechless. It had been years since he had attended any social function, let alone one that involved dancing and conversation with strangers. His immediate instinct was to refuse, but something in Katherine's expression, a mixture of hope and vulnerability, made him pause. She had asked very little of him personally, despite giving so much of herself to help him through his darkest days. "I'm not much for dancing," he warned. "Haven't done it since before the war." "We don't have to dance," Katherine assured him quickly. "Just having someone to talk with would make the evening more enjoyable for me. These functions can be rather tedious alone." Quentin doubted Katherine was ever truly alone at such events, given her popularity in town, but he appreciated the tactful way she had framed the request. "All right," he agreed finally. "I'll escort you." The smile she gave him was worth the discomfort he anticipated. "Thank you, Quentin. I'll look forward to it." The night of the social arrived all too quickly for Quentin's liking. He had purchased a new shirt for the occasion and had even visited the barber for a proper haircut and shave. As he studied his reflection in the small mirror in his room, he barely recognized the man looking back at him. The haunted, haggard look that had become so familiar after Thomas's death had faded, replaced by something less defined but more alive. He arrived at Catherine's door precisely at 7, hat in hand and nerves inexplicably jangling like a green recruit before his first battle. When she opened the door, however, all thoughts of discomfort vanished. Katherine wore a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her fair skin and brought out the green of her eyes. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, with small white flowers woven into the chestnut waves. She looked, Quentin thought, like something from another world, one of beauty and refinement that he had forgotten existed. "You look." He began, then faltered, unable to find words adequate to the vision before him. "Thank you," Katherine replied with a smile, understanding his meaning despite his lack of eloquence. "You look quite handsome yourself. The new shirt suits you." They walked to the community hall arm in arm, exchanging greetings with other townsfolk making their way to the same destination. The building was festooned with lanterns and wildflowers, and a small band was already playing a lively tune as they entered. To Quentin's surprise, the evening passed more pleasantly than he had anticipated. Katherine was a natural conversationalist, smoothing over any awkward moments and deftly including him in discussions about topics he knew well: the surrounding landscape, the condition of local trails, the prospects for the coming harvest. He found himself relaxing gradually, even accepting a plate of food and a cup of punch without feeling the urge to retreat to a corner. It was near the end of the evening, as the band struck up a slower waltz, that Katherine turned to him with a question in her eyes. "Just one dance?" She asked softly. "For me," Quentin hesitated, then nodded, placing his punch cup on a nearby table. "I may step on your toes," he warned as he led her to the edge of the dance floor. "I'm a doctor," she reminded him with a playful smile. "I can treat crushed toes quite effectively." He placed his hand carefully at her waist, taking her other hand in his as they began to move to the music. The steps came back to him more easily than he had expected, a distant memory of his mother teaching him to dance in their small farmhouse in Illinois, counting the rhythm aloud while his father watched with amused pride. "You dance very well for someone who claims to be out of practice," Katherine observed as he guided her smoothly through a turn. "Had a good teacher," Quentin replied, surprised by how natural it felt to hold her close, to move in harmony with her graceful form. As they continued to dance, the crowded hall seemed to fade away, leaving only the music and the woman in his arms. Catherine's eyes held his, warm and full of something that made his heart beat faster. When the music finally ended, he found himself reluctant to release her. "Thank you for the dance," she said softly, her hand still resting lightly on his shoulder. "Thank you for asking," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. They walked home beneath a canopy of stars, the night air cool and fragrant with the scent of sage and wildflowers. Catherine's hand remained tucked in the crook of his arm, a gentle pressure that anchored him to the moment. At her door, Quentin found himself lingering, unwilling to end the evening. Katherine looked up at him, her expression open and expectant in the silvery moonlight. "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" she asked. The invitation was innocent enough, but something in her tone suggested deeper possibilities. Quentin hesitated, suddenly uncertain. His feelings for Katherine had grown steadily over the weeks they had known each other, evolving from respect to friendship to something far more complex. But he was still a man grieving his brother, still learning how to live with loss rather than be consumed by it. "I should probably head back," he said finally, regretfully. "It's getting late." Katherine nodded, a flash of disappointment crossing her features before she composed herself. "Of course. Thank you for accompanying me tonight, Quentin. I enjoyed your company immensely." "As did I," he assured her, taking her hand impulsively. Words failed him again, but he raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that conveyed what he couldn't articulate. Her fingers trembled slightly against his as he pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Quentin," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "Good night, Katherine." As he walked back to his boarding house, Quentin found himself replaying the evening in his mind the way Katherine had looked in her blue dress, the feel of her in his arms as they danced, the warmth in her eyes when she had invited him inside. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt truly alive, every sense heightened and attuned to the world around him. The following morning, Quentin woke to the sound of urgent knocking at his door. Fearing news of another medical emergency, he quickly pulled on his trousers and shirt, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair as he opened the door. Instead of Billy from the livery or one of Katherine's patients, he found Pete from the saloon, his expression grave. "Marshal Harding's in town," Pete informed him without preamble. "Says he needs to speak with you urgent-like. He's waiting at the sheriff's office." Quentin's heart raced as he thanked Pete and finished dressing quickly. Had something gone wrong with the information he'd provided about Pike's gang? Or worse, had they escaped capture and were now threatening retaliation? The walk to the sheriff's office seemed both too long and too short. When he arrived, he found Marshal Harding in conversation with Sheriff Taylor, both men looking up as he entered. "Rowe," Harding acknowledged with a nod. "Glad Pete found you." "What's happened?" Quentin asked directly, too anxious for pleasantries. "We got Pike," Harding announced, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Him and his whole gang holed up exactly where you said they'd be." Relief washed over Quentin, followed quickly by confusion. "That's good news. Why the urgent summons?" Harding and Taylor exchanged glances. "There's more," Harding continued. "When we were bringing them in, Pike started talking. Seems he's hoping for leniency by providing information about other crimes." Quentin waited, sensing there was more to the story. "He claims the ambush that killed your brother wasn't random," Harding explained carefully. "Says they were hired specifically to target the two of you." The words hit Quentin like a physical blow. "Hired by whom?" "A businessman named Lawrence Blackstone," Taylor interjected. "Owner of the Clearwater Mining Company." Quentin shook his head in disbelief. "That makes no sense. We had no dealings with Blackstone or his company." "Pike says Blackstone believed you were carrying documents that could prove he was using illegal tactics to drive smaller claims off their land," Harding explained. "Something about water rights and forged deeds." A cold realization dawned on Quentin. Thomas had been talking to some of the independent miners who felt they were being forced out. He was gathering evidence for them, planning to take it to the territorial governor. "Did he have such documents with him when you were ambushed?" Taylor asked. Quentin nodded slowly. "A leather portfolio. The outlaws took it along with our money and Thomas's watch. I assumed it was just part of the robbery." "It was the target," Harding confirmed grimly. "The robbery was meant to look like a random attack." Quentin's mind raced as he processed this new information. Lawrence Blackstone was one of Clearwater's most prominent citizens, wealthy, respected, and known for his generous contributions to town improvements. The community hall where the social had been held the previous night bore his name on a brass plaque by the door. "Can you prove any of this?" Quentin asked, struggling to keep his voice steady as anger began to build within him. "Pike's testimony alone isn't enough," Harding admitted. "He's a known criminal with every reason to lie. We need corroborating evidence." "Which is where you come in," Taylor added. "We need to know everything your brother was working on, who he talked to, what evidence he might have gathered beyond what he was carrying that day." Quentin nodded grimly. "I'll tell you everything I know, and then we build a case," Harding stated firmly. "Properly, legally. If Blackstone is behind your brother's murder, he'll face justice but through the courts, not vigilante action." The warning was clear, and Quentin acknowledged it with a tight nod. "I understand. I gave you my word before, and it still stands." For the next several hours, Quentin detailed everything he could remember about Thomas's interactions with the miners, the conversations they'd had about Blackstone's company, and the documents Thomas had been collecting. By the time they finished, the sun was high in the sky, and Quentin realized he had missed his scheduled meeting with Katherine to visit a ranch south of town. "I need to let Dr. Davis know what's happening," he explained as he prepared to leave. "We were supposed to make a house call this morning." Harding nodded. "Go ahead, but keep the details to yourself for now. The fewer people who know we're investigating Blackstone, the better chance we have of gathering evidence before he gets wind of it. Quentin found Katherine at her clinic, tending to a young boy with a splinted arm. She looked up as he entered, relief evident in her expression. "Quentin, I was worried when you didn't show up this morning." Her eyes narrowed as she took in his tense posture. "What's happened?" "Something's come up," he explained vaguely, conscious of the young patient's curious gaze. "I need to speak with you privately when you have a moment." Katherine nodded, understanding the seriousness of his request. "I'm almost finished here. Billy's mother has already offered to take us to the Henderson ranch in their wagon when I'm ready." Quentin waited until she had completed treating the boy's arm and sent him on his way with instructions for care. When they were alone, Katherine turned to him expectantly. "Marshall Harding is in town," Quentin began, keeping his voice low. "They've arrested Pike and his gang." Katherine's face lit up with genuine happiness. "Quentin, that's wonderful news. They'll face justice for what they did to Thomas." "There's more," he continued, hesitating slightly. "Harding asked me not to share the details widely, but I trust you. Pike has implicated Lawrence Blackstone in ordering the attack." Katherine's expression shifted from joy to shock. "Blackstone, but he's one of Clearwater's most respected citizens," Quentin finished for her. "I know. It's hard to believe, but it fits with some things Thomas was investigating regarding Blackstone's mining operations." Katherine sank slowly into a nearby chair, processing the revelation. "What will you do?" "What I told Harding I would do: help build a legal case against all those responsible." Quentin ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Though part of me wants to confront Blackstone directly, which would accomplish nothing except perhaps getting you killed," Katherine pointed out sharply, "or imprisoned." Quentin managed a grim smile. "I know. Don't worry, I'm not planning anything foolish." Katherine studied him intently before nodding, apparently satisfied with what she saw in his expression. "Good. Thomas deserves justice, but not at the cost of your life or freedom." She rose and moved to gather her medical bag. "I should get to the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism has been particularly troublesome lately." "I wish I could accompany you," Quentin said regretfully. "Billy and his mother will see me safely there and back," Katherine assured him. "You focus on helping Marshall Harding. The sooner Blackstone faces justice, the sooner you can truly begin to heal." Impulsively, Quentin reached out to take her hand. "Thank you, Katherine, for understanding, for supporting me through all of this." Her fingers curled around his, warm and reassuring. "That's what friends do," she replied, though the slight hesitation suggested she might have considered another word. Over the next week, Quentin divided his time between assisting Marshall Harding with the investigation and continuing his work with Katherine. They maintained their twice-weekly visits to outlying homesteads, though Quentin was often distracted, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of Blackstone and justice for Thomas. Katherine, perceptive as always, noticed his distraction but didn't press for details, offering instead her quiet support and occasional gentle reminders to eat or rest when he became too consumed by the investigation. The evidence against Blackstone was growing steadily. Several miners had come forward with stories of intimidation and forged documents once they learned that Pike was in custody. A clerk from Blackstone's office, prompted by an attack of conscience, provided records showing payments to Pike that coincided with the ambush. The territorial prosecutor believed they would soon have enough to bring charges. It was during this tense period of waiting that Quentin received a message from Blackstone himself, delivered by one of the mine owner's assistants, an invitation to meet at Blackstone's office to discuss a matter of mutual concern. Quentin's first instinct was to refuse, but after consulting with Marshall Harding, they agreed that meeting Blackstone might provide additional evidence or insight into his operations. Harding would position men nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. "Be careful," Katherine urged when Quentin told her of the planned meeting. "Blackstone didn't become successful by being careless or merciful." "I'll be careful," Quentin promised, touched by her concern. "Harding's men will be watching the entire time." "That may not be enough if Blackstone feels cornered," Katherine warned. "Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks." I promise, Quentin assured her, taking her hands in his. I have too much to live for now. The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate fully. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, a flush coloring her cheeks as she squeezed his hands in acknowledgement. Blackstone's office was located in the most imposing building in Clearwater, a two-story brick structure that housed not only his mining company headquarters, but also the town bank, which he partially owned. The interior was expensively furnished, with polished wooden floors, oriental rugs, and oil paintings depicting scenic western landscapes. Lawrence Blackstone himself was a study in cultivated refinement, tall and lean, with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to wielding power. He rose from behind a massive desk as Quentin was shown into his office, extending his hand as if welcoming a valued business associate rather than a man whose brother he had allegedly ordered killed. "Mr. Rowe," Blackstone greeted him smoothly. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." "Please have a seat." Quentin shook the offered hand briefly, noting the firm grip and manicured nails before taking one of the leather chairs positioned before the desk. "Your message said you wanted to discuss a matter of mutual concern." "Indeed." Blackstone resumed his seat, steepling his fingers as he studied Quentin with shrewd eyes. "I've become aware that you've been assisting Marshal Harding with an investigation that appears to involve me." The directness of the statement caught Quentin by surprise, though he kept his expression neutral. "The Marshal's investigation involves the men who murdered my brother." "Yes, a tragic event," Blackstone nodded, his face a mask of practiced sympathy. "And now I understand there are allegations that I somehow orchestrated this terrible crime." "Did you?" Quentin asked bluntly. Blackstone's eyebrows rose slightly, but he appeared more amused than offended by the direct question. "No, Mr. Rowe, I did not. Pike is attempting to save his own neck by implicating me, a convenient target given my wealth and position." "There's evidence beyond Pike's testimony," Quentin countered. "Circumstantial at best, I'm sure," Blackstone dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Disgruntled miners with grievances against my company, perhaps a few financial transactions that can be misinterpreted if viewed through a prejudiced lens." Quentin leaned forward slightly. "Why did you want to see me, Mr. Blackstone? Surely not just to proclaim your innocence." Blackstone smiled thinly. "I wanted to make you an offer, Mr. Rowe, one that might benefit us both." "I'm listening," Quentin replied cautiously. "I understand your desire for justice," Blackstone began, his tone reasonable and measured. "But prolonged legal proceedings are rarely satisfying and often inconclusive. Instead, I propose a substantial financial settlement, say, $5,000 as compensation for your loss." The amount was staggering more money than Quentin had ever possessed at one time, but the implied admission of guilt behind the offer only strengthened his resolve. "You think you can buy me off?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I prefer to think of it as a practical resolution," Blackstone corrected smoothly. "The money would allow you to establish yourself, properly purchase land, start a ranch or business of your own, perhaps even court Dr. Davis properly, as I understand you two have become quite close." The mention of Katherine sent a chill through Quentin. "Leave her out of this." "Of course," Blackstone nodded, though his eyes held a calculating gleam. "I merely point out that your future could be quite promising with the right resources." "Why dwell in the past when you could be building something new?" Quentin stood slowly, his contempt for the man before him barely contained. "My brother's life isn't for sale, Blackstone. Neither is justice." Blackstone's expression hardened, the veneer of civility slipping slightly. "Be reasonable, Rowe. You're a nobody in this territory, a drifter with no connections beyond a female doctor who's barely established herself. Do you really think your word will stand against mine in a court of law?" "It won't be just my word," Quentin replied evenly. "Marshal Harding has been building a solid case. Your clerk has already provided records of payments to Pike. The miners Thomas was helping have come forward with their evidence." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Blackstone's face before he composed himself. "Allegations can be countered, witnesses discredited, documents explained. Legal battles are costly and lengthy affairs. Some things are worth fighting for, Quentin stated simply. Justice for Thomas is one of them. He turned to leave, but Blackstone's next words stopped him at the door. You should know, Rowe, that I rarely lose battles I choose to fight. If you persist with this, you may find that Dr. Davis's promising career in Clearwater becomes unexpectedly difficult. It would be a shame if her clinic were to lose its lease, or if certain influential families were to question the propriety of being treated by a woman. Quentin turned slowly, a cold rage building within him at the thinly veiled threat. Threatening Katherine is the biggest mistake you could make, he said quietly. Until now, this was about justice. Make it about her and it becomes something else entirely. Blackstone's smile was cold. Is that a threat, Mr. Rowe? No, Quentin replied. It's a promise. Stay away from Katherine. Face justice like a man instead of hiding behind your money and influence. He left without waiting for a response, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Outside, Marshal Harding was waiting nearby as arranged. Did you get what you needed? Quentin asked, his voice still tight with anger. Harding nodded, patting the small recording device concealed in his jacket. Every word, including the bribe offer and the threat against Dr. Davis, that should be enough to convince the judge to issue an arrest warrant. Relief washed over Quentin, though concern for Katherine quickly replaced it. He threatened her, I need to warn her. Go, Harding agreed. I'll handle things here. My deputies and I will arrest Blackstone within the hour. Quentin hurried to Katherine's clinic, finding her preparing medicines for the next day's patients. She looked up with a smile as he entered, but it quickly faded as she took in his tense expression. What happened? She asked, setting aside the mortar and pestle she had been using. Quentin explained the meeting with Blackstone, including the bribe offer and subsequent threat against her. Katherine listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled. Marshal Harding recorded everything, he concluded. He's getting a warrant now. Blackstone should be in custody soon, Katherine nodded slowly. That's good, but Quentin, men like Blackstone rarely act alone. He'll have associates, employees willing to carry out his orders even while he's detained. I know, Quentin acknowledged grimly. That's why I think you should stay with me until this is resolved. My room at the boarding house isn't much, but it would be safer than here alone. Katherine's eyebrows rose slightly. That would certainly give the town something to talk about. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Quentin felt a flush creep up his neck. I didn't mean. I could take a different room or sleep in the chair. I just want to make sure you're safe. Katherine's expression softened. I know what you meant, Quentin, and I appreciate your concern. But I won't be intimidated into hiding. My patients need me, and I won't let Blackstone disrupt their care. Katherine, Quentin began to protest. However, she continued, holding up a hand to forestall his argument, I would welcome your company here at the clinic. There's a spare room that my assistant occasionally uses when we have a patient who needs overnight monitoring. It's small, but it would allow you to stay close without compromising either of our reputations. Quentin considered the offer, recognizing the wisdom of her compromise. All right, he agreed reluctantly. But I want you to promise you won't go anywhere alone until Blackstone is safely behind bars. I promise, Katherine assured him. Now tell me more about what Harding plans to do next. They were still discussing the investigation when a commotion outside drew their attention. Looking through the window, they saw a crowd gathering in the main street, with Marshal Harding and his deputies escorting a handcuffed Lawrence Blackstone toward the jail. Blackstone walked with his head high, his expression one of indignant disbelief rather than shame or fear. As he passed the clinic, his gaze locked briefly with Quentin's through the window, a silent promise of retribution in his cold eyes. It's really happening, Katherine murmured, standing beside Quentin at the window. He's actually being arrested. Justice is coming, Quentin agreed, though he knew the arrest was just the beginning of what would likely be a lengthy legal process. That evening, after Katherine had attended to her last patient, they shared a simple meal in her small kitchen. Quentin had retrieved some personal items from his room at the boarding house and settled into the spare room, which, as Katherine had warned, was little more than a closet with a narrow cot. It's not much, she had apologized, but it's clean and private. It's perfect, Quentin had assured her, touched by her willingness to accommodate him despite the potential for gossip. As they sat at her small table, sharing a loaf of fresh bread and a pot of beef stew provided by a grateful patient, Quentin found himself studying Catherine's face in the warm lamplight. The events of the day had left their mark faint shadows beneath her eyes, a slight tension around her mouth, but her inner strength remained evident in the straightness of her posture and the steady gaze she returned when she caught him looking. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Quentin considered deflecting the question but found he wanted to share his thoughts with her. "I was thinking about how different things might have been if I hadn't met you." Catherine tilted her head slightly. "How so?" "I was headed down a dark path after Thomas died," Quentin admitted. "Consumed by grief and thoughts of revenge. If you hadn't needed a guide that day, if you hadn't shown me another way to live with loss." He shook his head. "I might be dead by now or a murderer." "You give me too much credit," Catherine demurred. "The strength to choose a different path was always within you, Quentin. I merely reminded you it existed." "Maybe," he conceded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "Either way, I'm grateful our paths crossed." Catherine's smile was warm. "As am I." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, then worked together to wash and dry the dishes. The simple domesticity of the task filled Quentin with a sense of rightness that had been absent from his life for too long. Later, as they sat in her small parlor, Catherine with a medical journal, Quentin with a book of Western poetry she had lent him, he found his attention repeatedly drawn from the page to her profile, illuminated by the soft glow of the oil lamp. The curve of her cheek, the way she absently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she concentrated, the slight furrow between her brows as she considered some medical point, all had become precious to him in ways he had never anticipated. He must have been staring too long, for Catherine eventually looked up, catching his gaze. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Quentin replied softly, "just the opposite." The days that followed settled into a new routine. During the day, Quentin assisted Catherine at the clinic when needed and continued to accompany her on her visits to outlying patients. In the evenings, they shared meals and quiet conversation, gradually learning more about each other's pasts and hopes for the future. News of Blackstone's arrest had spread quickly throughout the territory, generating both support and skepticism. Some townsfolk, particularly those who had benefited from Blackstone's business interests, were reluctant to believe the charges. Others, especially the miners and small landowners who had experienced his ruthless business practices firsthand, were openly celebratory. A week after the arrest, Marshal Harding returned to Clearwater with news. The territorial court had set a date for Blackstone's trial, and both Quentin and Catherine would be called as witnesses. "It won't be easy," Harding warned them as they sat in the sheriff's office. "Blackstone has hired the best defense attorney money can buy, a fellow named Harrington from San Francisco who's known for aggressive cross-examination." "We'll be ready," Quentin assured him, glancing at Catherine, who nodded her agreement. "There's something else you should know," Harding continued, his expression grave. "We've received information that some of Blackstone's associates may be planning to intervene before the trial. I've assigned a deputy to keep watch on the clinic, but you both should remain vigilant." The warning cast a shadow over the progress they had made, reminding them that the danger was not yet past. That night, as they prepared for bed, Catherine seemed unusually subdued. "What is it?" Quentin asked as she lingered in the doorway to his small room, a candle in her hand casting her face in gentle light and shadow. "I was just thinking about what Harding said," she admitted. "About Blackstone's associates. I've built something here, Quentin, a practice, a place in the community. The thought of losing it all because of one man's vindictiveness. That's not going to happen," Quentin stated firmly. "Blackstone will face justice, and any associates who try to carry out his threats will answer to me and to the law." Catherine studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. "I believe you. Good night, Quentin." "Good night, Catherine." 2 days later, their vigilance proved necessary. Quentin was returning from the general store, arms laden with supplies for the clinic, when he noticed a man he didn't recognize watching Catherine's building from across the street. The stranger's posture alert, yet attempting to appear casual, raised Quentin's suspicions immediately. Circling around to approach from behind, Quentin set down his packages and moved silently toward the man. Years of hunting and tracking served him well as he closed the distance without detection. "Help you find something?" Quentin asked conversationally, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. The man spun around, startled. He was younger than Quentin had expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much too young. "Just passing through," the stranger claimed, his hand drifting toward his own weapon. "I wouldn't," Quentin advised quietly. "Sheriff Taylor's just down the street, and I'm a faster draw than you might think." The man hesitated, assessing Quentin's calm confidence, then slowly moved his hand away from his gun. "You Rowe?" he asked. "I am," Quentin confirmed. "And you're one of Blackstone's men." It wasn't a question, and the man didn't bother denying it. "Boss said to deliver a message." "I'm listening." "He says there's still time to reconsider his offer. Double the amount if you convince the marshal to drop the charges. Otherwise." The man shrugged, the implication clear. Quentin stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Here's my message back to your boss. If anything happens to Dr. Davis or her clinic, if she so much as stubs her toe in the next month, I will hold him personally responsible, and his money won't protect him from me." The man smirked, but there was uncertainty in his eyes as he took in Quentin's deadly serious expression. Big talk from a man whose brother's already in the ground. Quentin moved faster than the man could react, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the nearest wall. "That's the last time you mention my brother," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now get out of Clearwater and don't come back. Next time I won't be so cordial." He released the man with a slight shove, watching as he straightened his jacket with an attempt at dignity before hurrying away. Only when the stranger had disappeared from sight did Quentin allow himself to relax slightly. The tension in his shoulders easing when he turned, he found Katherine standing a few yards away, medical bag in hand, clearly having witnessed at least part of the confrontation. "One of Blackstone's men?" she asked as he approached. Quentin nodded, retrieving the packages he had set aside. "Came to deliver a message and probably to scout the clinic." "And you delivered one of your own from the looks of it," Katherine observed, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the clinic. "I may have made the consequences of threatening you somewhat clear," Quentin admitted. To his surprise, Katherine slipped her hand into his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "My gallant protector," she said, but there was no mockery in her tone, only warmth and perhaps a hint of something deeper. The trial of Lawrence Blackstone was set to begin in Santa Fe the following week. The day before they were scheduled to depart, Quentin and Katherine made a final visit to the Wilson homestead to check on Sarah and the baby. The journey was peaceful, the late summer landscape awash in golden sunlight that turned the distant mountains into hazy purple silhouettes. Little Katherine, as they now called her, was thriving, a plump, healthy infant with her mother's blue eyes and a tuft of dark hair like her father's. Sarah, too, had fully recovered from the difficult birth, moving around the cabin with her usual energy as she tended to her family's needs. "We can't thank you enough," James Wilson told them as they prepared to leave. "If not for you both, we might have lost Sarah and the baby." "I was just doing my job," Katherine demurred, "and Quentin was the one who got me here safely through the storm." "Well, we're grateful to you both," Sarah insisted, cradling her daughter close. "And we'll be praying for you during the trial. The whole community's behind you, whatever some folks might say." The ride back to town was quieter than usual, both Quentin and Katherine lost in thoughts of the coming days. The trial would be challenging. Blackstone's attorney would attempt to discredit their testimony, to paint Quentin as a grieving man seeking a convenient target for his anger, and Katherine as a woman too emotionally invested in her friend's cause to be objective. As they neared Clearwater, Katherine broke the comfortable silence. Whatever happens at the trial, I want you to know I'm proud of how you've handled all of this, Quentin, seeking justice through proper channels, despite the personal cost it speaks to your character. Quentin glanced at her, touched by her words. Couldn't have done it without you, he replied honestly. Your strength has been my anchor through all of this. Katherine smiled, her eyes bright in the late afternoon sunlight. Perhaps we've anchored each other. That evening, their last before the journey to Santa Fe, Katherine prepared a special dinner: roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread from the baker, and a berry pie for dessert. She had set the table with her best linens and china, creating a sense of occasion that Quentin appreciated even if he didn't fully understand its significance. "What's all this?" he asked as he entered the kitchen, having spent the afternoon preparing their horses and supplies for the journey. Katherine, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove, smiled somewhat shyly. "I wanted our last evening here to be special, before the trial begins and everything becomes complicated again." Quentin washed up at the basin, studying her as she moved efficiently around the small kitchen. "It looks wonderful," he said sincerely. "Thank you." They ate by lamplight, the meal made more delicious by the care with which it had been prepared and the company in which it was shared. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on memories of their journeys together over the past months, amusing stories of Katherine's patience, and speculation about how Clearwater might develop in the coming years. "You think you'll stay?" Katherine asked as they lingered over the remains of the pie. "After the trial, I mean." Quentin considered the question, realizing he hadn't thought much beyond seeing Blackstone brought to justice. "I hadn't planned to leave," he replied carefully, watching her expression. "Unless you're suggesting I should." "No," Katherine answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. "No, I wondered if you might want a fresh start somewhere else once this chapter is closed." "There was a time when I would have," Quentin admitted. "After Thomas died, I couldn't imagine staying in a place so full of memories. But now," he paused, gathering his courage, "now there are new memories, better ones, reasons to stay." Their eyes met across the table, the meaning behind his words clear in his gaze. Katherine's breath caught audibly, her lips parting slightly as she absorbed his implication. "Quentin," she began, then hesitated. "I don't want you to feel obligated to stay because of our friendship." "Friendship," Quentin repeated, a slight smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like years. "Is that what we're calling it?" Katherine's cheeks colored beautifully. "What would you call it?" she challenged softly. Quentin reached across the table to take her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her smooth skin. "I'd call it the most important thing in my life," he said simply. "The reason I get up each morning, the hope that keeps me going when memories get dark." Katherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she turned her hand to lace her fingers with his. "I've been afraid to put a name to it," she confessed. "Afraid that once the pursuit of justice for Thomas is complete, you might not need me anymore." "Katherine," Quentin said, his voice rough with emotion, "I will always need you. Not as a guide through grief or a partner in seeking justice, though you've been both. I need you because you remind me that life can be beautiful even after great loss. Because you see me not just the grieving brother or the former soldier, but me." He rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and moved around the table to kneel beside her. It wasn't a formal proposal, they both knew it was too soon for that, but the gesture conveyed his sincerity, his willingness to humble himself before her. "I love you," he said simply. "I don't have much to offer, no land, no wealth, no grand prospects. But everything I am, everything I have, is yours if you want it." Katherine's free hand rose to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with tender wonder. "I fell in love with you gradually," she admitted. "First admiring your determination, then your kindness, your intelligence, your gentle strength. By the time I realized what had happened, it was already too late to guard my heart." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "I love you too, Quentin. I don't need land or wealth or grand prospects. I just need you, exactly as you are." The distance between them closed naturally, their lips meeting in a kiss that was gentle yet profound, a culmination of months of growing feelings and a promise of all that might follow. Quentin's arms encircled her waist as she slid from her chair to kneel with him on the kitchen floor, their embrace tightening as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Quentin felt something extraordinary, the upward curve of his lips into a genuine smile. It felt strange, almost foreign after so long, but also right. Katherine noticed immediately, her own smile brightening in response. "You're smiling," she observed, her voice filled with wonder. Quentin touched his own face, surprised by the unfamiliar sensation. "I guess I am, see." Katherine's eyes shone with happiness. "I told you it would come back, you just needed rest." "Rest and you," Quentin corrected, pulling her close again. "Mostly you." The journey to Santa Fe the next day felt different, charged with the energy of their newly acknowledged feelings. Though they maintained propriety, traveling with Sheriff Taylor and staying in separate accommodations, once they reached the territorial capital, there was a new ease between them, a sense of shared purpose that went beyond the upcoming trial. The proceedings lasted for 2 weeks, with Quentin and Katherine both providing testimony about Blackstone's threats and the evidence linking him to the ambush that had claimed Thomas's life. The defense attorney, as predicted, attempted to discredit their accounts, suggesting that Quentin was motivated by grief-induced vengeance and that Katherine's medical expertise didn't qualify her to assess criminal intent. Throughout it all, they supported each other, a reassuring presence during difficult testimony, a quiet word of encouragement during breaks in the proceedings, a steadying hand when emotions threatened to overwhelm. In the end, justice prevailed. The jury, presented with the recorded conversation in which Blackstone had offered a bribe and made threats, along with financial records and testimony from his former clerk, found him guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, sentenced Blackstone to 20 years in the territorial prison. As they left the courthouse after the sentencing, Quentin felt a profound sense of closure. Thomas had been avenged, not through violence or vigilante justice, but through the proper application of law. It was, he reflected, what his idealistic younger brother would have wanted. "How do you feel?" Katherine asked as they walked arm in arm through the bustling streets of Santa Fe, preparing for their journey back to Clearwater the following day. "At peace," Quentin replied honestly. "For the first time since Thomas died, I feel like I can think about the future instead of being trapped in the past." Katherine's hand tightened on his arm. "And what does that future look like to you?" Quentin stopped walking, turning to face her in the middle of the busy street, heedless of the curious glances from passers-by. "It looks like you," he said simply. "You and me, building something together in Clearwater. Maybe a house on that piece of land near the creek that comes up for sale next month. Children someday if you want them, a life of purpose and meaning and love." Katherine's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "That sounds perfect," she whispered. He kissed her then, propriety be damned, in full view of half of Santa Fe. And as her arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer, Quentin smiled against her lips, no longer an unfamiliar sensation, but the natural expression of a heart finally healing, finally whole. 5 years later, Quentin Rowe stood on the porch of a sturdy farmhouse overlooking Clearwater Creek, watching as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold behind the distant mountains. The land around the house was well-tended, a vegetable garden to the east, a small orchard to the south, a paddock with several horses to the west. It wasn't a grand ranch, but it was prosperous enough to provide for their needs, and then some. From inside the house came the sound of a child's laughter, followed by Katherine's warm voice reading a bedtime story. Their son, Thomas, named for the uncle he would never meet, was 3 years old now, a bright, curious child with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined spirit. As the final rays of sunlight faded, the door opened behind him and Katherine stepped onto the porch, slipping her arm around his waist. "He's asking for you," she said softly. "Wants a good-night kiss from Papa." Quentin smiled down at his wife, the expression now as natural to him as breathing. "Can't disappoint the boy," he replied, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead before going inside. In the small bedroom lit by a single oil lamp, Thomas was already half asleep, his favorite wooden horse clutched tightly in one hand. Quentin sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing back the child's dark hair. "Mama, read about cowboys," Thomas mumbled sleepily. "Like you used to be." "That's right," Quentin confirmed, "before I became a deputy and then a rancher." "Tell about Uncle Thomas," the boy requested, his eyes drooping despite his efforts to stay awake. It was a common bedtime request, as the child had developed a fascination with the uncle who shared his name. "Your Uncle Thomas was the bravest, kindest man I ever knew," Quentin began, reciting the familiar story. "He always stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult, and he would have loved you very, very much." By the time he finished the brief tale, Thomas was fast asleep. Quentin leaned down to kiss his son's forehead before quietly leaving the room, finding Katherine waiting in the hallway. "He's getting so big," she observed as they moved toward their own bedroom. "And more like you every day." "Poor kid," Quentin joked, earning a playful swat on the arm. "I received a letter from the Wilsons today," Katherine mentioned as they prepared for bed. "Little Katherine is starting school in the fall. Can you believe it's been 5 years already?" "Seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago," Quentin reflected, thinking of that rain-soaked journey and the difficult birth that had somehow brought him and Katherine closer together. As they settled into bed, Katherine curled against his side in a now familiar position, her head resting on his shoulder. "I have news," she said quietly. Something in her tone made Quentin turn to look at her. "What kind of news?" In the soft glow of the bedside lamp, Katherine's smile was radiant. "I confirmed it today. We're going to have another baby. I'm about 2 months along." Joy surged through Quentin as he gathered her in his arms, his smile so wide it almost hurt. "Another baby," he repeated in wonder. "Thomas will be excited to be a big brother." "I was thinking," Katherine said, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest, "if it's a girl, we might name her Emma, after my mother." "Emma Rowe," Quentin tried the name out. "It's perfect." They lay together in contented silence for a while, both contemplating the expanding family they had created together. Eventually, Katherine spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been? If I hadn't needed a guide that day, if you hadn't agreed to help me?" "Sometimes," Quentin admitted. "I was in a dark place then. Without you, I might have stayed there." Katherine raised herself up on one elbow to look at him more directly. "I prefer to think that you would have found your way out eventually. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Quentin." He smiled up at her, reaching to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." Katherine leaned down to kiss him softly. "Neither of us is alone anymore," she whispered against his lips. "And we never will be again." As Quentin held his wife close, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest, he marveled at how far he had come from those dark days after Thomas's death. The grief wasn't gone, it never would be completely, but it had transformed into something he could carry without being crushed by its weight. A memory that honored his brother rather than a burden that defined his life. And in its place had grown something beautiful, a love that sustained him, a family that brought him joy, a life rich with purpose and meaning. He had found his smile again, just as Katherine had promised he would, along with a happiness deeper and more enduring than he had ever dared to hope for. Outside their window, a shooting star streaked across the night sky, a brief, brilliant light against the darkness. Quentin made a silent wish of gratitude for the woman in his arms, the son sleeping down the hall, the child yet to be born, and all the days of love and laughter that lay ahead.